So we're talking about what does a child need before the teaching reading process. And the first thing was language. They need good language skills. The second one is what we call phonemic awareness. Okay, what is phonemic awareness? Well, phonemic awareness is the understanding that our speech is made up of sequential sounds. So when I say the word cat, what is that word? Okay, it's a sequence of sounds. K, a, t, cat. And in our heads, because we know the name of that animal, when I say cat, we immediately think, okay, the animal. But that word is actually made up of sounds. And those sounds are represented by the letters of our alphabet. And if we can understand the relationship of the letters to the sounds and how words are made up of sequences of sounds, we figure out the reading process. So a child needs to understand that words are made up of sequences of sounds. Phonemic awareness is the ability to hear a word that's been segmented, pulled apart into its sounds, and then be able to put it back together. So, for example, if I said to my child, what's this word? And he said drum. Okay, he's got budding phonemic awareness. He heard a word that had been pulled apart, and he heard the word, even though I had pulled the sounds apart. Then it's also the ability to do that process himself. So if I say, tell me the sounds in doll, d, a, o, can he do that? Okay, that is a huge, huge preparatory skill for learning to read. And that's something that preschoolers need to be working on. Now, let me explain something more about phonemic awareness. It is a developmental skill, which means some kids, all kids, they get, well, if they're exposed to it and they're taught, some kids just get it naturally, but some kids it needs to be taught. They get it at different ages. Okay, so it's just like potty training. You know, some kids are ready before other kids, and some kids get phonemic awareness before other kids. Some kids get it naturally. You don't really have to do anything, and they just pick it up. Other kids, you really need to train it. So it is a developmental skill. It's also what we call a metalinguistic skill. And what does that mean? Okay, language is used to communicate. Language is symbolic. So I say these sounds, and you understand the ideas that I'm trying to communicate to you. So I'm using language for a purpose. But when I'm talking about playing with language, let's pull the word drum apart. I'm not actually talking about a drum. I'm not communicating to you anything about a drum. I'm not talking about how you bang on it to make noise. I'm not talking about drum. I'm taking a linguistic element, a word, and I'm playing with it as though it's a thing. Okay? When you play with language in that way, it's metalinguistics. It's taking language out of its natural context, and it's like, let's look at this thing called a word. And it's an auditory back and forth, and we're going to play with it. Well, that's a skill that not all children have. So if you were to ask a 3-year-old, what are the sounds in cat? And now this is a 3-year-old who has not developed phonemic awareness. A 3-year-old is going to tell you, meow. Because to a 3-year-old, when you say, what are the sounds in cat, they're thinking of the little furry animal, and that's what they think of. They have no idea that you're talking about this word, and let's talk about a word. They don't get it because they can't separate the word from the thing that it represents. So when you ask a 3-year-old, they may not get it. Ask a 5-year-old who's developed phonemic awareness, and the 5-year-old will say, at, because they understand that they can play with the language. It's a metalinguistic skill. It is also a critical pre-reading skill, and it's an indicator of future reading success. In other words, children need phonemic awareness to succeed at the learning to read process. In fact, when you have older children who are struggling to learn to read, a lot of times we can trace that struggle right back to the fact that they never developed phonemic awareness. They don't have an understanding of how to pull the sounds of a word apart. And so when you're showing them a word, they don't understand how the letters are representing the sounds, which are parts of a whole we call a word. I will never forget, we have a Yahoo group, a fantastic Yahoo group for people that want to know more about spell to write and read. I remember this mom talking about her son, and she had been really trying to work hard on teaching him with spell to write and read. He was probably, if I remember correctly, I think he was about 9, and he just wasn't getting it, and she was struggling. And then one day he came downstairs for breakfast, and he said, "Mom, fireman." It was either fireman or fire truck. I know fire was one of the parts of the compound word. He said, "Fireman. That starts with f, right?" Oh my goodness, he was 9, and he was just starting to figure out that he could take a word and isolate a sound, and that was part of the big picture. We call that word. So that was part of the problem with this 9-year-old. He had never developed phonemic awareness. So when that mom started working with him on teaching reading, that was a sub-skill that he didn't have. And so she was trying to build on a foundation that wasn't there. And so that was part of the problem. So we think of developing phonemic awareness as something to do with little children, but it's something older children who are struggling probably need. Now, those of you who have the Spell to Write and Read book, if you go look at step 2, that talks all about phonemic awareness. And in fact, in that chapter, Wanda has all kinds of activities that you can do, that you can do with your student to help work on developing phonemic awareness. So how do I work on it if I don't have the book? What do I do? Well, you walk into any teacher supply store today, and they are going to have plenty of resources. Just ask at the counter, where's the phonemic awareness department? And they'll have an entire rack of materials. And there's lots and lots of things on the market today. When I was first starting out, way back when my kids were really, really little, and I was just starting this process, there was a book on the market called Ooples and Banunus, and that comes from do you know the song, "I want to eat, eat, eat apples and bananas"? Well, it's named after that song, Ooples and Banunus. And I'm not saying that that's the only thing, that's the best thing. I'm just saying that's what I used, and I loved it. It's just a little book. It's still on the market, and it comes with a CD, and the CD included all kinds of songs that played with language. And the book had games to play, books I could read that played with language. You know the book, I think it's McCluskey, John McCluskey, Make Way for Ducklings. That whole book is playing with language. And so that's what I loved about that book. I would pop, back then it was a cassette, I would pop that cassette in the cassette player in my car, and as we drove around town, we would listen to the music and we would listen to the songs that were playing with language. I would also do the phonemic awareness games with my kids while we were driving. So I would say, okay guys, I'm going to give you a word and you tell me what word it is. And because I was driving, I was constantly seeing things. So I would just, think of a word off the top of your head. I kind of go brain dead. But when I was driving, I would see things like sign. I'd say, okay, here's a word, S-I-N. And they go, sign, that's a sign. Or K-R. And they would say car, truck. And so we would play that game while I was driving. And then I would say, okay, your turn. And it was kind of like our version of I Spy with my little eyes. And what I was doing while I was just literally driving around town, running errands, getting to the grocery store, is I was working on phonemic awareness with my little ones. So that was how I did it with my kids. I didn't sit down, we're going to work on phonemic awareness now. I just kind of did it in passing. I did it while we were driving.